Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Micah Utrecht. I am, Micah Utrecht, yeah. I am editor of Jacobin magazine, as well as a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I want to thank ISO for having a number of Jacobin-sponsored sessions, which this session is at this conference, as well as welcoming DSA members like myself here. We're here to talk about lean production in education, and we're going to be talking about that with Kevin Prosen. Before I introduce Kevin, so let's give an announcement, a reminder that we are sharing the hotel tonight with the Wounded Warrior Games, an organization that's set up to help disabled veterans, so please remember to respect them and their space tonight. So we'll be talking about lean production in education, what that is, how it affects teachers. And Kevin Prosen will be talking about it. Kevin is an 8th grade English teacher in Queens, New York, and a rank and file activist in the movement of rank and file educators of the United Federation of Teachers, as well as an activist of UCOR, which is a national network of rank and file teacher reformers. And if you're a teacher who is interested in something, in joining a national network of reformers and teachers unions, you should probably talk to him afterwards about that. He's written a bunch for Jacobin for In These Times, and in response to some of his past union activism, he was once called by the New York Post, quote, a hipster dude who crawled straight out of Zuccotti Park. So without further ado, let us turn it over to the hipster dude.
The only time I've ever been flattered by that description. Thank you very much, Micah. I want to thank Jacobin for inviting me to give this talk today, and I want to thank the organizers of the conference for hosting it. I want to thank all of you for coming out at 8 o'clock on a Friday night to hear a talk about school administration. If that doesn't demonstrate steely determination in the struggle for socialism, I really don't know what would. I try to keep this short. That's probably not going to be easy, so if you have a fidget spinner, you might need that. I'm just going to jump right in. So the story's going to begin here in Chicago on September of 2010. On the set of the Oprah Winfrey Show, where the Facebook CEO, Oprah, right? Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg was appearing, flanked by New Jersey's tough-talking Republican governor, Chris Christie, worse than Oprah. And it's hard to believe, but at this point, his career was actually on the ascendancy. And also Newark's new mayor, Cory Booker, who was the fresh face of the Democratic Party. There's a lot of villains in this talk, so I just want to say it. At that time was the fresh face of the Democratic Party and one of their most prolific fundraisers. Now, a few months earlier, at a retreat hosted by a Wall Street tycoon named Robert Allen, Booker had approached Zuckerberg with a bold idea. With an influx of corporate cash and a cross-party alliance between neoliberal Democrats and Republicans, they would be able to implement a series of reforms to remake the public schools of one of America's poorest cities from top to bottom. If it could happen in Newark, it could happen anywhere. Now, Booker, who's very adept at hustling money out of different corporate players and always has his eye to the national spotlight, was very eager to turn the city of Newark into a proof point for a raft of neoliberal experiments that he hoped would serve as a national model for school reform, and in doing so, position himself for higher office. Christie, who was making a name for himself among the Republican base after a video emerged of him berating and humiliating an elementary school teacher on YouTube, had just won the governorship of New Jersey, and Booker viewed his election as a unique opportunity to push through reforms that Christie's predecessor, the Democrat John Corzine, might have opposed, as he was considered too close to the state's teachers' unions. Having botched a bid for a national race to the top federal education grants due to a clerical error, Christie's reputation as an efficient manager of public education was already in need of a bit of a fix-up. As for Zuckerberg, he was also eager to buffer his public image because the new Aaron Sorkin film, The Social Network, had been released a few months prior, depicting the boy wonder CEO as a somewhat scheming, manipulative, and arrogant jerk who betrayed his closest friends. By announcing his entree into social engineering through philanthropy, Zuckerberg would begin to position himself as not just an obscenely wealthy child billionaire, but a truly influential corporate tycoon capable of mobilizing his immense wealth to shape important social policy. Booker and Christie laid out their vision of school reform to Oprah, who turned to Zuckerberg and said, "So Mark, what role are you playing in all of this?" Zuckerberg told her that he was offering the city a grant through his new startup education foundation of $100 million to be matched by further funding from other donors from Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Before the words could leave his mouth, the audience and Oprah erupted into an awed applause and standing ovation. When Winfrey asked him why had he chosen Newark of all places as the object of his largesse, Zuckerberg had to admit that he knew little about the city, but had been charmed by the bipartisan dynamos flanking him on either side. "Newark is really just because I believe in these guys. Running a company, the main thing I have to do is find people who are going to be really great leaders and invest in them. And that's what we are doing here. We're setting up a $100 million challenge grant so that Mayor Booker and Governor Christie can turn Newark into a symbol of educational excellence for the whole nation." Now, we have the benefit of hindsight, so we can definitely question placing a $100 million bet on the political dexterity of Chris Christie, but Newark would indeed become a kind of example for national education reform, though the achievements would fall far short of what they expected. Now, in this strange tableau, we find so much that characterizes modern school reform. A massive influx of corporate cash, a dark alliance of union-busting Republicans and slick cash-lubricated Democrats, and the fawning media dazzled by wealth and the gauzy veneer of a civil rights light ideology that would paper over the corporate agenda pushed by a new nexus of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and these bipartisan political power brokers. The reforms they sought included imposing test-based evaluations on including reorganizing the workflow of schools with up-to-date methods of data-driven corporate management, and dramatically increasing the number of union-free charter schools. And these reforms comprise the game plan of the corporate school reform movement. Like generations of school reformers before them, they would find their success limited by inherent aspects of the educational bureaucracy, overt resistance from educators and parents, and intrinsic aspects of like Bill Gates, noted that up to 40% of students were requiring remedial courses in college. Too many were struggling to finish high school within 4 years, and that American schools produce far too many scientists and engineers. By imposing new educational standards written in consultation with leading tech firms and university administrations, they would be able to make every child college and career ready. How many teachers are in the room, by the way? Okay, you're probably all sick of hearing that slogan, college and career ready, at this point. They also noticed, not incidentally, that in a fragmented state-by-state educational system where each state school system had its own educational standards, textbook publishers and software developers struggled to create their products tailored to each local system. Therefore, it was necessary to consolidate a national market for educational products produced by publishers and tech entrepreneurs who would then be able to more effectively market their products to schools. Now, impressed by the opportunity to re-engineer the American labor force through new state standards, Bill Gates mobilized through his foundation $200 million behind the Common Core State Standards Initiative, which he used to curry influence with everybody from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to local politicians to teachers' unions like the American Federation of Teachers, who until recently continued to accept money from the Gates Foundation. In a country where education policy is still set primarily at the state and local level, this incredible mobilization of private wealth allowed Gates and other Common Core backers to build a coalition and implement these standards nationally without democratic deliberation or the kind of responsible trial and error testing you might normally expect from a sweeping education reform. The Common Core would amount to a national experiment on America's public school children. Coupled with the standardization of school curriculums were new methods of evaluating teachers, based on high-stakes tests produced by private corporations at enormous cost to local school districts. Using methods developed by economists called value-added modeling, They claim to be able to identify the exact contribution a teacher made to student achievement, their value added, by isolating it from other factors like family income level, parents' educational attainment levels, child's nutritional levels, and so forth. Value-added modeling would later prove to be ineffective in its own terms. So, for example, the elaborate teacher evaluation system that was created where I work in New York City was based largely on value-added modeling, but had to be scrapped after a court challenge where like an award-winning teacher was found to be ineffective according to value-added measures. And a judge found that the tests and the formula yielded results that were, quote, arbitrary and capricious. There was more variation for one teacher from one year to the next than there were between teachers, and the system was unable to actually isolate the impacts of the teacher in the manner promised. Indeed, many of the technocrats who designed value-added modeling formulas had later come to cast doubt on its effectiveness themselves. However, school reformers would continue to push for merit-based teacher pay tied to student performance on these standardized tests based on this flawed model. And this was the primary goal of Zuckerberg's Newark investment. In fact, half of the $100 million that he donated were dedicated to creating a model of teacher evaluation to be included in a new renegotiated contract with the city's teachers union. Zuckerberg hoped to give bonuses of up to 50% of a teacher's annual salary to top performers while eliminating the bottom performers by weakening teacher seniority and tenure protections. Now, what he didn't bother to learn prior to launching the initiative was that tenure was not included in the teacher contract. Rather, like in many states, it's enshrined in state law, the result of struggles by teachers to ensure their job security in previous decades. This required him to enter the political sausage factory and get bogged down in complex negotiations with state Democrats heavily financed by the New Jersey Teachers Association. So while they were able to eventually renegotiate tenure protections somewhat in New Jersey, they were unable to abolish job protections for teachers completely. Now, another aspect of this lean production regime is the use of new data-driven technologies to streamline the process of education in schools. And this is big business. So Apple, Google, and Facebook have been at the forefront of a multi-billion-dollar industry in educational technology. Although in the past 2 years, Google in particular has developed a sophisticated marketing strategy identifying early adopters of their technology in schools to help them promote their hardware like Google Chromebooks and software like Google Docs and Google Classroom, which has allowed them to surpass Microsoft and Apple in the education marketplace. In 2016, Google Chromebooks accounted for 58% of mobile devices shipped to primary and secondary schools, which is up from 1% in 2012. How many of you have had a box of these show up in your school in the last few years? Right. Last year, Facebook announced its own initiative to put its own adaptive learning software in 120 schools around the country as a pilot. This software purports to put students in charge of their own learning, a goal we all share, though in the Facebook methodology, the program consists of Facebook-designed algorithms to determine students' learning needs and develop courses of study personalized to each student. So in this model, students will engage with learning through a digital, personalized learning platform done on computers, with teachers' roles redefined as that of a mentor and facilitator, helping students who are stuck but otherwise facilitating student engagement in an automated process of learning guided by new artificial intelligence technologies. So Facebook's software apparently generates something like 50,000 different data points an hour about the students using it. And this, of course, raises all sorts of questions about student privacy. And it's scary stuff, but there are also plenty of reasons to be skeptical about whether these programs will truly take root, as the history of technology and education shows. And I'm going to give some historical examples in a little bit of previous technological fads and their short careers in America's schools. Now, this is part of a pattern that pertains again and again in education reform. Corporate reformers mobilize wealth, resources, and popular coalitions in order to pursue educational reforms modeled on business practices. These reform pushes do succeed in achieving some of their aims, but inevitably fall short of their overall goals. And they fail because they seek to impose their agenda from above without understanding or caring about the nature of the job that they seek to reform, and thus find themselves hoisted by their own petard. After 15 years and billions of dollars in philanthropic investment, in everything from small schools to core standards to teacher evaluation systems, the Gates Foundation acknowledged last year that they failed to make the kind of systemic change that they were seeking. As New York City's teacher evaluation system, backed by Gates, was being gutted of its test-based aspects, which were the heart of the system, the director of the Gates Foundation said last year, quote, "Unfortunately, our foundation underestimated the level of resources and support required for our public education systems to be well equipped to implement our standards. We also missed an early opportunity to sufficiently engage educators, particularly teachers, but also parents and communities, so that the benefits of the standards could take flight from the beginning." Gates was shocked that teachers rejected the opportunity to become better at their jobs through his teacher evaluation system, and he said, "If you invent a malaria vaccine, nurses don't ask you to uninvent it," throwing his hands in the air at the strange instincts of America's 3.3 million public school teachers. Now, despite the air of novelty around today's Silicon Valley educational visionaries, a longer view of the history of education reform in America suggests that they're in fact borrowing from a time-honored playbook for business mobilization around schooling in America. Much like business-minded reformers before them, they seek to remake American education by importing business methods, new technologies, and principles of organization borrowed from the modern workplace and adapt schooling to the changing needs of an evolving capitalist system. In comparing today's school reforms to those of a previous era, we can contextualize the aims and promises of school reformers, make sense of their strategies, and learn something important about the role of schools in society and the possible horizons of education reform in America. So this next portion of the talk is going to be a little historical. The point of comparison that I've chosen is an era roughly between the years 1910 and 1930. This was a period of transition in the history of American capitalism in which an emerging progressive coalition of captains of industry, urban school reformers, forward-thinking educators, and intellectuals began to search for ways to adapt schools to the needs of an economy characterized by the emergence of large corporations. But the most influential component of this coalition would be the business elites able to integrate other interest groups into a movement coordinated under corporate hegemony. Like today's school reformers, they would seek to take control from above, constructing a system that would borrow from the common sense of business leaders at the time. Most importantly, the fixation with efficiency that gripped the country at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, as in today's era of corporate school reform, the efficiency movement took place in the context of a gilded age of gross inequality, where elites sought to control from a distance the operation of public schools. Both then and now, they sought to adapt schools to new technologies emergent at the dawn of the new century, and both adopted unquestioningly the logic of business administration as an ideal template for public education. Their first objective was one of school governance, to remove schools from the political control of the local community. And so, we found a series of struggles at the turn of the last century over the centralization of control of schools to remove decision-making from what they called politics, by which they meant the influence of lay people, parents, teachers' organizations, and local politicians. Now, much like the movement for mayoral control in large cities today, and I believe in Chicago there's an ongoing struggle over an elected school board, for example. Now, mayoral control is a system where cities abolish school boards entirely and place schools under sort of mayoral dictatorship. Reformers of the progressive era decried the inefficiencies of local decision-making with its pluralistic negotiation of different communities' interests. Typically, these reforms meant shrinking school boards and empowering superintendents to function as a kind of chief operating officer of school systems. The model here was a corporate boardroom of the large trusts that these corporate leaders had constructed in the previous decades. Like the neoliberal era, the progressive era celebrated technocratic governance and the press to professionalize the field meant placing schools under the control of so-called experts, schooled in the corporate efficiency doctrines of the time, which would make up this new science of school administration. The reform agenda of this era, like the movement today, also relied on bypassing democratic input through the centralization of authority and the use of private dollars to fund new initiatives. And at the turn of the century, there was an enormous philanthropic investment in education, as foundations like Carnegie, Ford, and others poured resources into initiatives to reshape schools according to the needs of this new corporate capitalism. The goals of these efficiency reformers were to create a stratified labor force adapted to the vertically differentiated workforces required by the modern corporation. Schools were to play the role of effectively allocating students to their social role, and so new programs were created for different students to facilitate this differentiation. Classes were increasingly separated out by academic ability and disability, as determined by a dubious new technology of IQ testing. And vocational tracks, industrial job training in the schools essentially, were integrated into new high schools to prepare students for their role in the factories. Large capitalists increased investment in vocational schooling. So for example, J.P. Morgan donated $500,000 to New York City's trade schools at the time. This was initially resisted by the American Federation of Labor as a regime for condemning working class children to life in the lower rungs of the proletariat, but later would come to accept the vocational school reforms in an attempt to try to shape them from the inside, a sort of prototype for Randy Weingarten's attempt to retain a seat at the table with today's school reformers. Efficiently moving students through their progression of studies and turning them out into the working world was a major preoccupation for school reformers, sparked by journalistic investigations into the inefficiencies of the existing system. So there was a famous study at the time by a guy named Leonard Ayres that was called Laggards in Our Schools. It gets worse, trust me. He had gathered data from schools' records that purported to show that schools were filled with what he called retarded children, by which he meant students who were over age for their grade. Now, his study was one of the first to depict the school not as a moral seminary or a place of civic virtue, but a factory subject to the same compulsions for efficiency as any industrial firm. By ranking schools on an index of efficiency he created, Ayres' study did not focus so much on proficiency in subject matter learned, but in time spent in school and the cost to taxpayers of such laggards. In response to Ayres' explosive report, school reformers would cast about for ideas on how to render schools more efficient producers of the industrial working class, and school administrators, vulnerable to the whims of their corporate backers and eager to appease them, would respond to this demand. In searching for a solution, they would stumble on the ideas of Frederick Winslow Taylor, father of scientific management. Got any Taylor fans here? All right, Taylor's system was a means of scientific management in the industrial field designed to increase the productivity of firms by streamlining the labor process. Wasteful use of industrial resources was the result of bad management, by which he meant allowing workers to use their own unscientific methods of production learned through experience and passed on from one worker to the other, as well as what he called soldiering by workers, which was just doing less than humanly possible in the course of a working day. Taylor believed there was one most efficient way of doing any job, and his mission was to create means of discovering these methods through analysis of the labor process itself, removing that knowledge from the control of the worker and placing it in the hands of management, who would then be able to break down the task and impose their one best method onto the workers. Soldiering could be discouraged by introducing competition into the labor process, creating incentives for increased output through systems of merit-based pay, and that should sound familiar to those of us who work in the schools. By separating the mental aspects of labor, the design and conception of the labor process itself, from menial task performance, Taylor's system would reduce the levels of skill required to perform a task, thus rendering workers more easily replaceable and reducing their leverage on the job while empowering management. Now, in the years between 1911 and 1925, there was an aggressive push towards efficiency in education, borrowing explicitly from Taylor's system of scientific management. A whole new sector of the field, educational efficiency experts, grew as school systems established efficiency bureaus and hired out consultants from schools of education. As one superintendent from Kansas City told a meeting of the National Education Association in 1914, there were, quote, so many efficiency engineers running handcars through the schoolhouses in most large cities that the grade teachers can hardly turn around in their rooms without butting into 2 or 3 of them. The work of these efficiency experts was to create standards by which to measure the output of schools. Franklin Bobbitt was a professor of educational administration at the University of Chicago, whose 1913 book, The Supervision of City Schools, laid out the agenda of the new educational science. His approach centered on defining standards for a school's final product in the manner of quality control in a factory. For Bobbitt, education was, quote, a shaping process, as much as the manufacture of steel rails. As to how these standards should be determined, Bobbitt argued it was not up to schools or educators to design them, but the community, by which he meant the business and industrial magnates who were increasingly flexing their influence in the educational world. By creating standards, it would be possible to create scales of measurement by which school supervisors could identify inefficient teachers who were unwilling to improve. For Bobbitt, and this language, of course, prefigures the language of Gates and Common Core people very closely. For Bobbitt, the problem was that too many teachers were intellectualists, unwilling to cooperate with the new corporate style of management, which reduced them to mindless implementers of systems designed from outside the schools. He argued strongly against any form of academic freedom in pursuit of the most efficient best practices. To enforce this new efficiency regime, it was necessary to find a system of rating and evaluating teachers and rewarding them based on merit. So in 1913, the American School Board Journal reported that educators across the country were creating elaborate plans for the evaluation of teachers. And by 1915, the National Society for the Study of Education yearbook reported that 350 cities of over 10,000 people were rating teachers in some way or another. So there's another University of Chicago professor, and these guys all seem to come out of University of Chicago, named Arthur C. Boyce, created what he considered an objective scale of teacher efficiency designed to reduce arbitrary and subjective evaluations of teachers. And that's what people have in their handout there. What that is on the side that's not a grid-looking thing is an efficiency record from the 1920s that was used in these school systems to try to assess teachers. Now, how many of you work in a school system where they use the Danielson Rubric or something like that? That's what you have on the other side of your paper. And what I want to point out here, that's one page from a 54-page document outlining every aspect of what a teacher does in the course of a class period. I want to highlight the continuities between this older system and what we have now. The modern rubrics might be a little more nuanced or detailed, but they consist of the same basic idea, which is to break down teachers' labor into discrete aspects and tasks and render judgment of whether teachers were performing them at maximum efficiency or not. Today they don't say efficiency, they say effectiveness. So like their Silicon Valley inheritors, reformers would increasingly look to new technologies to introduce efficiency in education. And like today's school reformers, they were full of grand promises about what film, radio, and later television would do for schools. So Thomas Edison predated the Zuckerbergs of today and today's techno-utopian school reformers in 1922 when he said, quote, "I believe the motion picture is destined to revolutionize our education system, and that in a few years it will supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks. I should say that on average, we get about 2% efficiency out of our school books as they're written today. The education of the future, as I see it, will be conducted through the medium of the motion picture, where it should be possible to obtain 100% efficiency. By 1931, 25 states and departments organized entirely around the use of visual media. But despite fairly aggressive marketing of the technology to schools, most teachers use the medium infrequently, more so in elementary schools than in secondary education, a pattern that persisted with later technological innovations as well, due to the more complicated scheduling structures of secondary education, and teachers struggled to simply procure the technology required to project a video. As anyone who works in a school knows, there's a sort of curse on all educational technology where it will break down when you most need it with incredible reliability. Radio was another panacea promoted by school reformers. In 1932, Benjamin Darrow wrote, "Radio, the assistant teacher," which claimed, quote, "The central and dominant aim of education by radio is to bring the world to the classroom, to make universally available the services of the finest teachers, the inspiration of the greatest leaders, and unfolding world events, which through the radio may come as vibrant and challenging textbooks of the air." Another radio booster, William Levinson, wrote in 1945 that, quote, "The time may come when a portable radio receiver will be as common in the classroom as is the blackboard. Radio instruction will be integrated into school life as an accepted educational medium." Didn't quite work out that way. A school survey of superintendents in 1937 showed that just over 7% of districts could say that all schools used radio in class. 17% said many did, 51% said few, and 22% said none. In a survey of Ohio schools in 1940-41, and this was the state that was most aggressive in promoting radio, only 15% of schools claimed they regularly used radio in the classroom. Those who did not usually cited no or poor radio equipment, bad reception, broken radios, or difficulties in school scheduling, inability to procure the school radio, and a lack of teacher interest. Television, another innovation heavily promoted by the Ford Foundation in the 1950s and 60s. Ford grants provided for televised education took several forms, but was typically, like previous technologies, limited to a supplemental role as a teaching aid rather than a total instructional program. Teachers found that usually the TV program was just some other teacher doing the same lesson they would have done, but on a small screen with staticky reception. Rolled out during the years of the baby boom amidst fears of a teacher shortage, television's promoters saw the medium as a sort of surrogate teacher, and yet television, like radio and film, would be relegated to, at best, a supplemental role in schools. Perhaps providing a tired teacher with a few minutes of relief to show a video about zebras in the later half of a long working day, but never living up to the vision of its most enthusiastic boosters. So all of this should chasten today's technological promoters, because what we're finding is that there's a historical pattern that's hard to ignore here, and there's a reason for it, which is teachers have hard jobs that are complicated. You got to keep 30, if you're lucky, kids who are involuntarily kept in school on task and attentive, and you have to do it all with very little time. And so when you have to go down the hall and sign out the TV and make sure everything's lined up in the course of a day, when you have absolutely no time to yourself, something that's gotten worse with the introduction of lean production, teachers tend to comply at a minimal level, close their school door, and do what they want. So while each of these technologies had early adopters and enthusiasts, all of them failed to fully permeate the school day and supplant more traditional teaching methods. And this is because, again, school reformers, like those who promoted other efficiency reforms, were unfamiliar with schools as a work setting or the nature of the profession and what teachers do in the course of a day. Therefore, the definitions of the aims of these technologies were likely to differ from those of teachers. Teachers are unlikely to share the engineer or corporate sponsor's enthusiasm for reducing the size of the teaching workforce or selling more radios and Chromebooks, and are likely to provide at best token compliance to mandates that don't meet the criteria of practicality within the unique setting of the classroom. So what can we learn from this brief historical survey of these two moments in school reform? The first is that schools exist within capitalist social relations. Capitalists mobilize to reform schools when the methods of organization are no longer adapted to the needs of corporations, and their output, workers, must be reallocated and re-engineered to suit the needs of capitalist production as conceived by leading fractions of the capitalist class. In both the progressive era and today, newly ascendant sectors of capital mobilize diverse coalitions, incorporating various and often conflicting interest groups, but always under business hegemony, to remake education. This process requires them to incorporate the demands and interests of other groups to build popular legitimacy for their agenda. So think here of the AFL's incorporation into the vocational schools movement, or Randy Weingarten's signing on board with merit pay schemes in Newark, Or we can also think of the way that the School Voucher Coalition brings together strange bedfellows like suburban Catholics, black educational equity activists, but always under the hegemony of major Republican politicians, foundations, and think tanks like Betsy DeVos, the Bradley Foundation, and so forth. We can also think of the way charter schools market an elite agenda of union-busting and school privatization behind the veneer of civil rights by tapping into legitimate frustrations of parents of color against the racist inequities in public education. Now, because capitalists seek to align schools to the demands of a changing capitalist economy, they look for organizational and pedagogical solutions borrowed from the dominant business models of their time. In the progressive era, this meant attempting to tailorize education by applying the methods of scientific management to analyze and quantify teacher labor. In the modern school reform era, they build on these advances in industrial organization, like lean production, to try and reduce costs and streamline the schools. Capitalists always have an interest in increasing productivity, which explains the continuity of efficiency as an animating priority, and they seek to do this through familiar methods: control the labor process itself, as well as the introduction of new technologies. So this is a lot like how it works in industry. In Marxist terms, we are at the Socialist Conference, they're raising the organic composition of capital by having more work done by machines and reducing as much as possible the investment in variable capital, teachers' labor. Teachers' salaries and pensions do, of course, still remain the largest part of the educational budget, one they are always looking to cut. Now, the reason these reforms fail, however, is because aspects of schools as workplaces and teaching as a job render them inherently resistant to this overweening control from above. Schools are not factories under the dictate of a manager, but loosely coupled bureaucracies riven at every level by the influence of rival interest groups, coordinated by complex sets of federal and state laws, and subject to certain forms of bureaucratization from below, such as collective bargaining agreements, laws protecting labor or students' rights that are the result of struggles from previous eras. And these place further obstacles to elite reform that cannot be evaded easily without the collaboration of interest groups invested in them, like teachers' unions. And I think it's very telling that the reforms that stuck in Newark were the ones that the unions punted on fighting, like weakening seniority and introducing merit pay, value-added model, teacher evaluation, and so on. Teachers labor in separate rooms, largely free from direct supervision for most of the time. Eventually, the efficiency expert, the educational consultant, the professional developer, or assistant principal leaves the room, the teacher closes their door, and continues to work according to their own lights, using methods and tools they find practical, issuing token compliance to mandates that undermine their ability to effectively instruct their children. Reform efforts that are designed and implemented from above that don't take into account the realities of teachers' labor, those reforms that are done to teachers rather than by them, are bound to crash against these obstacles eventually, which explains perennial complaints from education reformers that teachers are conservative and resistant to change. What's more, efforts to quantify teachers' labor and measure its results, such as standardized testing, simply cannot accurately do so due to the nature of our raw material. Kids are human beings, not inert hunks of pig iron that can be transformed through the clever designs of an engineer. Student learning is affected by factors far beyond the school walls, and learning encompasses broad ranges of intellectual and social competencies that resist being broken down into discrete, measurable silos of individual skills. Therefore, attempts to measure efficiency through high-stakes testing, these complex teacher evaluation rubrics, and so on, inevitably fail on their own terms, as the history of value-added measurement shows quite clearly. So it's these two factors, the loosely coupled organizational structure of schools, as well as the irreducible nature of the labor process itself, that explain why teachers themselves are suspicious of corporate education reform. It helps explain something that I believe makes teachers unique in the workforce, and that is the persistence of a certain kind of craft labor ideology among teachers. By that, I mean teachers consider their work not merely a quantifiable scientific endeavor, but also a site for the free play of the imagination and an opportunity for personal expression. We'll always resist quantification because our job isn't just a science, it's also an art.